Welcome, class. This is Chapter 4, Human Digestion and Absorption. So kind of like what this picture shows, we are going to learn how we can go from food we eat, such as this sandwich here, through the digestive tract, which is pictured here. This is actually the large intestine, and then use that to generate energy. Some learning outcomes for the day. We are going to learn about the GI tract, all of the organs of the GI tract, and the accessory organs, which are the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Learn how foods are moved along the GI tract, discuss absorption, identify key enzymes and hormones, identify major nutrition-related GI diseases and disorders. When I say GI, I'm referring to gastrointestinal, so it's just an abbreviation I use. Discuss diarrhea around the world. This will be just very brief. Okay, so let's begin. Digestive organ system. GI tract, like I said, that means gastrointestinal tract. The organs included in the GI tract are the mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. Accessory organs to this are the liver, pancreas, and gallbladder. And together, this system performs the mechanical and chemical processes of digestion, absorption, and elimination. So we're going to track how food moves through the GI tract. In general, it takes about 2 days to move through the GI tract. It may be a little bit quickly in men versus women. And it spends a various amount of time in each section of the GI tract. So the stomach, about 2 to 3 hours, the small intestine, 3 to 10 hours, large intestine, up to 72 hours, and then the whole digestion absorption process, like I said, the 2 days. Obviously, this varies person to person and depending on what you're eating, but we're going to learn about that coming up. So this is a diagram that just kind of tracks how food goes, the flow of food through the GI tract. And you can see that it starts in the mouth. The component number 1 is labeled mouth and salivary glands, and we're going to learn exactly why those are important. But the mouth mechanically breaks up food into much smaller pieces and exposes the surface of that food to different enzymes, as well as the salivary glands produce mucus that lubricates the food so that it can move quicker down the GI tract. The next step is the esophagus. The esophagus is the tube connecting the mouth to the stomach, and food will travel through the esophagus via peristalsis. Next, the stomach, which you all are probably pretty familiar with. The stomach can hold about 4 cups or 1 liter full. When it's empty, it's usually about half this size. And we're going to learn all about the stomach, but it has very many important functions. Here, we kind of have steps 4, 5, and 6. And it's not that food travels directly from the stomach to the pancreas, the gallbladder, or the liver. It's that those 3 organs secrete important components that allow food to further be digested in the small intestine. So the small intestine is number 7, and there's 3 components of the small intestine: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And the small intestine is where the majority of absorption takes place of nutrients, as well as water. And the next part is the large intestine. There are certain electrolytes absorbed here, as well as some other things. Finally, what's left of the digestive process, which is usually fiber and some bacteria, go to the rectum and are passed out through the anus. Digestive system overview. This is a pretty great overview of actually watching the digestive system in real life. So there's actually something missing here, and it's digestion. Digestion is the process of breaking down foods into a form the body can use. And remember, we said there's mechanical as well as chemical digestion. Absorption is the uptake of nutrients from the GI tract into the blood or lymph. We're going to learn a little bit about what the lymph is. And then lastly, excretion of waste, which I think you guys are pretty familiar with. So this is a picture of the GI tract, a section of the GI tract. And you can see it's made up of different muscle types. There's many layers to it. On the innermost layer, there's a mucosal layer and a submucosa. And you can see it's very vascular, meaning it has a very rich blood supply. There's also many nerves that surround this GI tract, and that gives its ability to do so many functions. So this is a tube. It looks like a tube. And if you think about it, humans actually are tubes. There's a tube from our mouth all the way down to our anus, and it is hollow on the inside. And that's what food moves through. Sphincters. So sphincters are one of the key ways that the passage of food is controlled through this tube. And we have many, many sphincters, which we'll see coming up. This picture is highlighting some particularly important ones. The esophageal sphincter, which is often called the lower esophageal sphincter, and that is where the stomach and the esophagus intersect. And this sphincter prevents contents from the stomach from flowing back up into the esophagus, because the stomach, which we'll learn, is actually very acidic. The other sphincter you see here is the pyloric sphincter, and this sphincter is between the connection of the bottom of the stomach and the small intestine, and it causes slow flow from the contents of the stomach into the intestine, which is highly regulated. Sphincters respond to various stimuli such as signals from the nervous system, hormones, different environments, acidic versus alkaline, which is basic conditions, as well as pressure. If you eat a lot of food, you're going to have a lot of pressure on that stomach. The sphincters are kind of like gatekeepers that control the flow from one segment to another. This is a chart from your book that is looking at a couple, well, more than a couple, but some different sphincters in our body and the importance of all of those sphincters as well as the function of those sphincters. Just to highlight a couple, the sphincter of Oddi controls the flow of bile. We're going to talk about bile a lot. The ileocecal valve is very important. This connects the small intestine to the large intestine and prevents contents from the large intestine to going into the small intestine. The large intestine is very bacteria rich, and it would be potentially harmful if some of those bacteria ended up in the small intestine. Okay, so these are some of the sphincters. Okay, GI motility. So motility is movement of the GI tract. And movement of the GI tract is what allows the contents of the GI tract to mix with enzymes and hormones that it needs to, and as well also the content of the GI tract to move downwards through the GI canal to its endpoint in the rectum and the anus. Peristalsis, and I do have a video of this, so I highly recommend you check out this video, as well as we're going to see pictures on the next page. But peristalsis is a type of movement that uses contractions to kind of push or propel material from point to point. Generally speaking, well, always this is a downward motion if you are standing up. So from the top where you start to ingest food down to the bottom. And not all sections of the GI tract use peristalsis, but we do find it in the esophagus as well as some of the intestine area. Segmentation is a back and forth movement, and segmentation is really important because it breaks up the food by mixing it together. So the goal of segmentation is not so much to push it forward, but more to churn it and mix it. And this happens in the large and the small intestine, but mostly in the small intestine. And then mass movement is peristalsis over a wide area. Elimination is when we go to the bathroom. In the case of the GI tract, we're only talking about stool or feces. Excuse me. And vomiting is not a normal function, but when contents of our stomach obviously come up and out through the esophagus. So here are some pictures that illustrate both peristalsis and segmentation. And you can see in peristalsis, what's called the bolus, which is kind of a clump of food, is actually being moved across the screen, where in segmentation, that bolus is actually just being broken down into smaller components. Digestive tract secretions. So the secretions of the digestive tract are not only numerous, but also very, very important. Without some of these, digestion just really wouldn't occur in the way that it does. It's a very coordinated process. Some of these you may be familiar with and others may be unfamiliar to you, but we're going to talk about all of them in detail. So you might be looking at this picture and wondering what this is. It kind of looks like a chrysalis, the cocoon a caterpillar makes before it turns into a butterfly. At least to me it does. This is actually a real-life photo of the gallbladder, and the gallbladder is an organ that we're going to learn about that stores one of these secretions called bile and contracts to release it when the rest of our body needs it. Bile helps mix and emulsify fats, so bile is excreted in response to fats. Here's a table from your book with some of the important secretions and summaries of them. Obviously, in the mouth, you have saliva. Also in the mouth, you have something called amylases. These are starch digesting proteins and enzymes that occur in the mouth. The salivary glands also secrete a little bit of lipases. Lipases can digest fats. There's mucus that happens in the mouth. Acid, which is in the form of hydrochloric acid, is secreted in the stomach. Bile is actually made in the liver, then stored in the gallbladder, which you just saw. Bicarbonate is a base secretion, so that means it's the opposite of an acid, and it is secreted into the small intestine to actually neutralize the acid coming from the stomach. And then hormones, we're going to talk about in greater detail. There are many hormones governing the GI functions. So I've mentioned briefly that there are enzymes in the GI tract. And what exactly are enzymes? What do they do? Enzymes are components that can break apart or catalyze different reactions. So in this particular picture, you have a molecule of sucrose, which is made out of the sugars glucose and fructose, and they're connected to a bond. So this is called a disaccharide. Our body can use these sugars efficiently when they are separate. So we have an enzyme called sucrase. And you may notice that sucrase sounds very similar to sucrose. Most enzymes are named for the substrate that they work on and then have ASE at the end. So when the sucrose binds to the sucrase, in the presence of water, the enzyme is actually able to break that bond and separate the two components of the sucrose into glucose and fructose, which we can then use for energy production. The enzyme is then free and kind of recycled in a way to be used again. So enzymes would be components of GI secretions. Okay, so now we're going to start at the top and go down. So we all know that we start eating with our mouth. And I briefly mentioned that chewing is really important. Chewing mechanically breaks up the food. It also helps with taste. It also helps volatilize some compounds so that we can smell them better, which contributes significantly to taste. It exposes parts of the foods to different enzymes and mucus in our mouth. And it's quite a vital function. Saliva is a secretion from our mouth and contains different enzymes. One is called lysozyme, which helps break down bacteria on our food. Mucus is secreted from our mouth, or in our mouth is a better way to say this. And mucus helps lubricate and hold the bolus together. So remember, the bolus is kind of a clump of food. And we don't necessarily eat food in clumps, but during the chewing process and kind of when the food passes into the esophagus, it forms what we call a bolus. Amylase breaks down starch, and so this is an enzyme in our mouth that helps break down starch. And actually, as that starch breaks down, the flavor becomes a little bit sweeter. Taste and smell. So what are the taste sensations? Sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. This should actually say 5. I'm sorry, I don't know why this is 6. This should say 5. That's a typo. Olfactory cells. So olfactory cells refer to cells that help us smell. And the olfactory system is actually the system that allows us to smell. And so smell actually plays a huge role in our ability to taste. When you can't smell, most people will report reductions in taste. This is a picture of the tongue, and there's different kind of parts of the tongue as well as different taste buds, which are considered the papillae on the tongue. And the tastes are indicated by colors here. And so what you notice is you can actually taste all of the colors or all of the tastes on each section of the tongue. Previous research thought that only some tastes were tasted or recognized on certain sections of the tongue, but we now know we can recognize taste throughout. Esophagus. So the esophagus is a pipe or tubing, you could say, that connects from the back of our mouth or the back of our oral cavity to the stomach. And we actually have 2 pipes that connect from the back of our kind of oral cavity down. However, the other one is the trachea, and this goes to our lungs. So when we're eating, it's very important that food does not go into the trachea, and instead it goes into the esophagus, so it can be channeled to the stomach. As we swallow, the bolus of food is moved from the oral cavity down into the esophageal cavity and then down through the esophageal tube. The bolus of food in this picture is represented by yellow. If that bolus were to end up in the trachea instead of the esophagus, a person would hopefully gag, but it's possible some of that food could get into their lungs and they could potentially even choke, so that would be bad. So I think that I mentioned, maybe I didn't, but there's something really important here that maybe you see it, maybe you don't, and it's called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a small fold that as we eat covers the trachea so that no food goes down there, and all the food is directed into the esophagus instead. And the epiglottis is key to prevent choking. Once food is in our esophagus, it will move downwards towards our stomach by peristaltic motion. Yikes. Sorry. Okay. So the stomach, food enters the stomach through, hopefully you guys remember, the lower esophageal sphincter, and the stomach is a holding and mixing tank. In the stomach, food is mixed with gastric juice, and gastric juice is composed of water, hydrochloric acid, and enzymes. The acid in the gastric juice destroys the biological activity of proteins. It converts inactive digestive enzymes to their active forms. It partially digests protein and makes dietary minerals soluble so that they can be absorbed. The mixing that takes place in the stomach produces a watery food mixture, which is called chyme, which we'll see on the upcoming slides. And so this is a large picture of the stomach and then a smaller picture of the stomach. And we're going to see some more detail coming up. Other important functions of the stomach is production of something called intrinsic factor. And this is an important protein that helps us metabolize vitamin B12. So this is a picture of the stomach as well as a couple YouTube videos you can check out. And here you'll notice that the stomach is muscular, as all portions of the GI tract are. It's also very vascular. And then inside the stomach, it almost looks like a brain, but what those are folds, and they're called rugae. And the folds increase the surface area of the stomach and help with the churning and the mechanical mixing of the food. So kind of when food enters the stomach, like I said, it mixes with gastric juice. And as it mixes with gastric juice, chyme is formed. When that process is kind of complete or near complete, the chyme can exit the stomach through the pyloric sphincter into the duodenum, which is the first section of the small intestine. And this chyme leaves the stomach very slowly at about 1 teaspoon at a time. This is a blown up picture of the inside of the stomach, and you can see this almost brain-like texture that is called the rugae. Deep in the rugae are these folds which create pits, and inside the pits are all sorts of very important cells that have different secretions. Some of the cells, for example, are the mucus cells, which you can imagine what they secrete. They secrete mucus. The reason it's so important to secrete mucus is because the stomach is very acidic. And by secreting mucus, we help prevent the stomach from digesting itself by that hydrochloric acid that it contains. Other cells are parietal cells, and these cells actually help with the hydrochloric acid, secreting that, as well as the intrinsic factor. G cells secrete gastrin. And then you see something called chief cells, which secrete pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is an enzyme, and it is activated by the hydrochloric acid, and then it becomes pepsin, and that can break down different components in the stomach. So secretions of the stomach, here they are, kind of what I summarized. Yeah, I think this is pretty good. Parietal cells, like I said, make hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid inactivates proteins, destroys bacteria and viruses, dissolves the minerals, and helps convert pepsinogen into pepsin. Pepsin is then something that can help with protein digestion. Gastrin is a hormone that is secreted by the G cells, and it controls the release of the HCl, the hydrochloric acid, and the pepsinogen. So this is just a picture from your book, but I kind of like it because it shows the pH scale going from 0 to 14, with 7 in the middle being neutral. And just how acidic is the stomach? It is very, very acidic. The stomach acid or gastric juice has a pH of 0.9 to 3.0, which you can see compared to some common chemicals and household items and foods, just how acidic that is. So it's very, very, very acidic. You can also see pancreatic juice here. This is a pH of 8. So pancreatic juice and bile actually help neutralize that stomach acid component. Okay, so I mentioned that after the mixing is complete in the stomach, or as it completes, something called chyme will enter the small intestine, and it will enter via the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter, like I said, releases food very, very slowly, about 1 teaspoon at a time, and chyme, when it first hits that small intestine, is acidic, but there are lots of things that happen to neutralize that chyme. So the pancreas, for example, makes bicarbonate to neutralize it, and that helps. There are stretch receptors and chemoreceptors in the first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum, and they stimulate reflex pathways that lead to more gastric secretion, gastric motility, and emptying of the stomach. So as the duodenum is filled, which is the first part of the intestine, it tells the stomach that it can be filled some more. Sections. I mentioned the duodenum. This is the first section of the small intestine. It does receive the chyme, which is acidic, but it also receives the digestive juices from the pancreas and gallbladder. So the pancreas is going to give it bicarbonate, the gallbladder is going to give it bile, and this is the site of most chemical digestion of nutrients. It's 10 inches long. The middle section of the intestine is called the jejunum, and it is 4 feet long. And the last section is called the ileum, which is 5 feet long. So some more in-depth pictures of the small intestine. Here you see the small intestine blown up into the insides of the intestine and then into something called villi and microvilli. So in the small intestine, there are, I don't even know, millions of small finger-like projections called villi, and these stick out into the inner part of the small intestine. And each villi has its own blood and lymph supply. And the villi greatly increase the surface area of the small intestine so that nutrient absorption is maximized. On the villi are actually something called microvilli, which are even smaller finger-like projections, which again increase the surface area hugely of the small intestine. Let's see. So once the acid is neutralized in the small intestine, digestive enzymes can go to work. Chyme will be moved through the small intestine by peristalsis, as well as segmentation, so that it can be mixed very well with these digestive juices. And the digestive juices contain enzymes that help break down carbs, protein, fat, and prep for vitamin and minerals for absorption. Small intestine. So this is an actual picture using a microscope, obviously, of the small intestine. And here you can see some of these finger-like projections, or villi. On the villi are some really important cells. Some of them are goblet cells, which make mucus. Endocrine cells produce hormones, and enterocytes produce digestive enzymes. The physical structure of the small intestine is crucial to its function, and the combined folds of the intestine, the villi, and the microvilli increase the surface area of the small intestine 600 times what it would be without this structural component. Accessory organs. So I mentioned already what these are. The first is the liver, which this top largest organ is the liver, this kind of peachish colored organ. And the liver produces bile. The liver also recycles bile. The liver has many other functions that we won't really talk about today, but it helps with blood coagulation. It stores absorbed products of digestion. It detoxifies chemicals. So the liver is a very crucial organ. The next accessory organ is the gallbladder, which we'll see in more detail. But once the liver makes the bile is transferred to the gallbladder, which is a storing tank for the bile. When there is fat in the small intestine, it's a signal to release the bile. The pancreas is the third accessory organ, and the pancreas has both endocrine and digestive functions. Endocrine means it makes hormones, so it makes the hormones insulin and glucagon. And it also makes digestive juices, which are part of its digestive function. So it makes pancreatic juice, which is composed of water, bicarbonate, and different digestive enzymes. Bicarbonate, like we saw on that pH scale, has a pH of about 8 and helps neutralize that acidic chyme that's in the intestine. And by neutralizing the chyme, it helps protect the small intestine from erosion from that acid. Hormones of the GI tract. Okay, there are many hormones of the GI tract, and we're going to see how these are all interrelated. Gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone produced by G cells. Its release is stimulated by the stomach expanding due to food you ingest. It's also stimulated by protein and caffeine, and it can be stimulated by basic chyme. It stimulates secretion of gastric juice, which is hydrochloric acid, mucus, and pepsinogen, which remember is the inactive enzyme that precedes pepsin. Next hormone, cholecystokinin, or CCK. So release of CCK is stimulated by fats and amino acids in the small intestine. And CCK stimulates pancreatic cells to produce pancreatic enzymes. It also helps stimulate the gallbladder to release bile. Secretin is stimulated by acidic chyme in the duodenum. So the second that acid from the stomach goes into the duodenum, it causes secretin release, and secretin stimulates the pancreatic duct to produce large volumes of sodium bicarbonate to neutralize that acid. It also inhibits gastric emptying to prevent further acid from entering the duodenum until that acidic chyme is already digested. Gastric inhibitory hormone stimulates release of insulin and inhibits gastric secretion and motility. Okay, so this is a picture showing where many of these hormones work. So the first thing that happens is we eat. Food enters our stomach and triggers gastrin release. If it's protein or caffeine, or by these pressure receptors that expand the stomach wall. Gastrin release then stimulates secretion of hydrochloric acid, mucus, and pepsinogen, as well as promotes gastric motility. The third step, as food is mixed in the stomach and chyme begins to move into the duodenum, a few hormones start to play a role. First, secretin causes the pancreas to produce bicarbonate, which helps to neutralize that acidic chyme, as well as slow gastric emptying until it's neutralized. Secretin also stimulates the liver to make bile, which is also basic pH. It's not acidic, and that helps neutralize the acid. Gastric inhibitory peptide is released. This stimulates insulin and reduces gastric motility. And cholecystokinin, or CCK, is released, and this is released due to the presence of fats in that small intestine, and it causes the pancreas to release pancreatic enzymes, as well as causes the gallbladder to contract and release that bile to help digest the fats. Then the materials, after passing through the duodenum, enter the jejunum, where some of the absorption happens. And this is the key where the insulin is important. So this is a picture of the stomach and the chyme, as well as the liver and the gallbladder. And you can see kind of what's happening here as that acidic chyme enters the duodenum, and it causes release of CCK and secretin. The CCK and secretin enter the bloodstream. They then travel, send signals. Bile salts will be transported to the liver, causing the liver to produce bile more rapidly. The gallbladder will then contract, releasing that bile, and CCK will help the gallbladder contract. Bile will be reabsorbed to the blood and be able to digest the nutrients. This is a summary slide of some of the hormones that we've talked about today. Okay, so absorption. Now that we have used these hormones and enzymes to break it down, how do we absorb the food that we have? Absorption mostly occurs in the small intestine and can happen by 4 different mechanisms. The first is passive diffusion. And passive diffusion relies on concentration gradients. So when nutrient concentrations are higher in the inside of the intestine than they are in absorptive cells, the difference in concentration gradients drives those nutrients into the absorptive cells, such as water, fat, and some minerals. Passive diffusion is great because it doesn't require any energy or carrier molecules. It's kind of the simplest types of absorption. Facilitated diffusion requires the same kind of concentration gradient, something going from high concentration to low. However, it also requires a carrier protein to assist that compound to go across the membrane into the absorptive cell. And a component that we utilize facilitated diffusion for is fructose. Active diffusion requires a carrier protein and energy, which is in the form of ATP. And so it doesn't matter if it's a high or low concentration, you have to have both of those components there. Glucose and amino acids use this type of absorption. Lastly, there is endocytosis, which is engulfment of compounds or liquids, which is when cells can literally kind of almost eat nutrients or bring those nutrients inside of the cells. First, it forms an indentation, particles move into that indentation, and then the cell kind of regrows around it and then will absorb it. So once absorbed, water-soluble compounds such as glucose and amino acids are transported by the capillaries to the portal vein. So this is part of the circulatory system. The portal vein goes to the liver, and then the liver will start to break those things down. Fats, however, can't mix with blood because you have fats, which are lipids, and blood, which is more water-like. And so fats actually have to be absorbed into something called the lymph, where they're further processed before they move on to the bloodstream. So here is a picture of 3 absorptive organs: the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine, and what is absorbed in each one. The stomach actually is a very minimal organ as far as absorption goes. You can see it does not absorb very much at all, except for alcohol. The small intestine is where the majority of absorption happens, and then the large intestine last. So I briefly mentioned that some molecules would be transported into the circulatory system, such as glucose, amino acid, and water-soluble compounds. Those would go directly into the capillaries. The capillaries then will branch into larger arteries and veins and travel to the portal vein to the liver. And I mentioned that fat-soluble nutrients would have to go through the lymphatic system. So what exactly is the lymphatic system? It's like a complementary circulatory system that carries something called lymph fluid. And I highly recommend you watch this video because it's a really great explanation. But the lymphatic system is a network of lymphatic vessels and the fluid that moves through them. The lymph vessels take up excess fluid that collects between the cells and return it to the bloodstream. Lymph is kind of like blood. However, it's able to carry the fat-soluble particles, and there's no red blood cells or platelets in there. The lymphatic system doesn't have a pump, so it doesn't have its own heart like the circulatory system does. And lymphatic circulation is driven by muscle contractions. The lymphatic system plays a very big role in immunity, but it also transports molecules from fat digestion and fat absorption. It transports them because they're too large to enter the bloodstream, so they have to be passed through the lymph before they can enter the bloodstream. Okay, so that was all happening in the small intestine. Now, what is happening in the large intestine? Absorption of water and electrolytes, for example, sodium, potassium, some fats, biotin and vitamin K that might be made by bacteria, and maybe 10 to 30% of water. Formation and expulsion of feces. Feces is what's left over from digestion. and housing of bacteria. We're going to talk about the microbiome coming up. The large intestine is different than the small intestine because there are no villi or microvilli, those finger-like projections, so the absorptive surface is much smaller. Also, there are many, many bacteria present in the large intestine. There are different components of the large intestine. There's the cecum, appendix, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, anus, anal canal, and anus. When the contents of the small intestine enter the large intestine, the material left doesn't really look like the food we originally ate. And only about 5% of nutrients remain. So only about 5% of carb, protein, and fat is undigested. Mostly what's there is fiber, intestinal cells, some body waste, and bacteria. Okay, so the microbiome. I mentioned that there are lots of bacteria that live in the large intestine, but are these bacteria harmful? Absolutely not usually. So normal healthy individuals have a healthy population of bacteria living in their large intestine. And these bacteria actually play a lot of functions, including protecting them from unhealthy or dangerous bacteria. They also synthesize some vitamins, vitamin K and biotin, as well as some fatty acids. They help ferment dietary fibers or foods that we can't break down. And they produce some helpful gases, which maybe you don't think are so helpful, but they really are. Probiotics are probiotics are bacteria found in food that we can eat that can colonize our intestinal tract. Prebiotics is food we can eat that will be food for those bacteria. And this is just a nutshell, but the microbiome has been related from everything from autism disease to Alzheimer's disease to obesity to diabetes to even depression and mood issues. So this is a really hot topic. I've got some great videos here. I recommend you watch them, as well as if you are interested, you can analyze your own or microbiome or actually send your a sample away to be analyzed for you. So that's pretty cool. What happens when everything we've talked about today doesn't work? There are a gamut of gastrointestinal issues that people can have, and this is, again, just going to be a brief touch on some of them. Heartburn or gastroesophageal reflux disease, which is called GERD, is where somebody has acid from the stomach that is able to either splash up or leak up or penetrate the esophagus. And the esophagus doesn't have a protective mucus coating to protect it from that acid. So this can cause an irritation of the esophagus that really is painful. Some foods as well as some behaviors make it worse, and some are listed here. Ulcers are almost like, I think of blisters that occur in the stomach. The most common causes of these are a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, and then NSAID use, which NSAIDs are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications, which are the most commonly prescribed drug around, especially for people over 65. But those can put you at high risk for ulcers. And when you have these kind of blisters in your stomach, they can even bleed, they can rupture. The blistered area isn't protected by the mucus. It can be very painful when you eat, as well as it doesn't have the absorptive surface that the healthy area has. So here's a picture of acid kind of splashing up into that esophagus and some of the esophageal inflammation that could occur in gastroesophageal reflux disease or heartburn, the common term. There are recommendations to prevent both of these things. You can read those on your own. And then additional digestive issues. Diarrhea, I feel that you guys are probably all familiar with. Issues with diarrhea is you can lose a lot of water and a lot of salt through diarrhea. So this is when food and chyme are traveling through the digestive tract too quickly for you to absorb the important nutrients. And actually, globally, diarrhea is the cause of thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths worldwide. Gas isn't actually harmful, but you may find it bothersome. Gas is a result of those nice microbiota breaking down things that are undigestible to you. Constipation is where you have to strain when you are going to the bathroom, when you have infrequent bowel movements, when you feel like you haven't fully gotten anything out. And there are some major issues with constipation. Food intolerances, we'll talk about a little bit later. Irritable bowel and inflammatory bowel disease, as well as hemorrhoids and diverticula, which we will see some pictures. So a few GI issues, gallstones, you can actually have crystallized compounds form in the gallbladder, which will block that bile duct so that bile cannot flow. They can also be very, very painful. Diverticula are kind of out pockets in the intestinal tract, and they're not harmful when they exist, but they can become infected and inflamed and then become very painful and cause malabsorption. And then last but not least, which again, this is a very brief covering of this topic, celiac disease. Celiac disease is an intolerance to gluten, a true sensitivity allergy to gluten. Gluten is a protein. It's found in wheat, rye, barley, spelt, triticale, and contaminated oats. Oats don't naturally have gluten, but many facilities that process oats also process the aforementioned foods, so there's higher risk. It's relatively common, but also undiagnosed. The only true way to diagnose this is by an intestinal biopsy, because if you do an intestinal biopsy, which is actually surgically going in and taking a small sample from the intestinal tract, you will see there is damage and inflammation to the villi and the microvilli, those fingers. It's not just the GI tract that's affected. However, people suffer a variety of symptoms from tiredness to migraines and many, many others. And the treatment is gluten-free diet for life. If they avoid gluten foods, they should be fine. And we can discuss this more in upcoming chapters. So that's all about the GI tract for now. And thank you for listening. Goodbye.